December 20th, 1944. Ardennes forest, a frozen graveyard of steel and silence. Snow drifts cling to the hulks of burnt-out Shermans, their barrels pointed uselessly toward the gray sky. The air is thick with exhaust and fear, the kind that settles deep in a soldier's chest when he knows the enemy's machines are better. Down in a half-frozen ditch, Corporal Harold Red Lawson kneels beside his tank, bare hands trembling as he pries open an engine panel slick with oil. The Panther's growl echoes from the woods ahead, deep, mechanical, unstoppable. His crew waits inside, whispering prayers through the frost. Lawson's wrench slips. Sparks fly. He knows what he's about to do breaks every rule in the Army Ordnance Manual. But orders don't matter now. The official fix will take hours, and they'll be dead in minutes. He leans into the engine, muttering, "She'll run hotter, but she'll run faster." Somewhere beyond the tree line, a Panther's cannon booms, and with that single act of defiance, one American mechanic begins to rewrite the fate of Sherman tanks in the Battle of the Bulge. By the winter of 1944, the war in Europe had entered its bloodiest and most deceptive phase. The Allies believed victory was near. German cities were burning under endless bombardment, and the Wehrmacht was retreating on every front. Soldiers spoke of Christmas at home, but beneath the calm of snow-covered Belgium, Hitler had prepared his final, desperate counterstroke. At dawn on December 16th, the Ardennes erupted. More than 200,000 German troops, 1,000 tanks, and self-propelled guns surged through the mist, a last gamble to split the Allied line and force a truce on German terms. It would be called the Battle of the Bulge, and it would become the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. The Americans were caught off guard. Many divisions were resting, understrength, or newly arrived. The dense forests and narrow roads turned the offensive into chaos. German panzers advanced with precision, led by the fearsome Panther tank, a weapon that seemed almost invincible in the eyes of many Allied crews. The Panther, with its sloped 80mm frontal armor and long-barreled 75mm K-42 cannon, was a masterpiece of battlefield engineering. It could punch through a Sherman's hull before the American gunner even found his range. Its sighting optics were sharper, its armor thicker, its silhouette lower. A single Panther could disable several Shermans if it caught them exposed. The Americans, meanwhile, fought with the M4 Sherman, reliable, fast, and easy to produce, but fatally under-armored for head-on duels. Its 75mm gun could rarely penetrate a Panther's front plate, forcing Allied tankers to maneuver for side shots. The Sherman's gasoline engine also burned violently when hit, earning the grim nickname Ronson, after the lighter that lights every time. What the Allies had in numbers, the Germans made up for in quality. Nearly every veteran tanker in the Ardennes would later recall the terror of hearing a Panther's engine growl through the fog, a sound like metal thunder in the trees. But there was another battle being fought far behind the front lines, one less visible, but no less critical. The battle of mechanics, fuel lines, and steel tolerances. Every Sherman relied on a vast logistical network stretching from Normandy beaches to depots deep in France. Thousands of mechanics men like Corporal Harold Lawson worked day and night in freezing mud to keep tanks rolling. They replaced engines, rewired radios, patched armor with scrap metal, and improvised with whatever parts they could find. Yet these men were bound by strict Army ordnance regulations. Unauthorized modifications were forbidden. The reasoning was sound. Every Sherman had to remain standardized so parts could be swapped easily, and maintenance manuals could apply universally. But on the battlefield, the rules of logistics rarely matched the urgency of survival. Lawson and others knew it. They watched Sherman stall on frozen fuel, seize up on steep inclines, and die in combat when even the smallest mechanical edge might have saved lives. Inside every maintenance unit, there were whispers of crews experimenting with higher octane fuel, altered gear ratios, and adjustments to recoil systems. Some of these field fixes worked, others caused catastrophic failures. Still, the front line didn't care about regulation. The Ardennes offensive had turned every repair yard into a triage ward for machines. Men hammered out fenders with rifle butts, melted snow for coolant, scavenged from wrecks to rebuild the living. By the time Lawson's unit was pushed back toward the small Belgian town of St. Vith, his frustration had boiled into defiance. His tank, a Sherman M4A3 with a Ford GAA engine, had suffered the same flaw 3 times. slow throttle response under freezing conditions, making it sluggish during combat maneuvers. The official fix required depot-level recalibration, but there were no depots left, just snow, oil, and the sound of advancing Panthers. In that frozen ditch on December 20th, 1944, he made a decision that every mechanic dreams of and every officer dreads. He would fix the flaw his way, not by the book, not by permission, but by instinct. That instinct, born from grease-stained experience and desperation, would soon spread across multiple tank units. Because Lawson wasn't alone across the Bulge, hundreds of mechanics were quietly rewriting the rules of armored warfare without ever asking for approval. And that quiet revolution began to show its first signs as the battle raged on. The Battle of the Bulge was not just a contest of armies. It was a test of systems. The German war machine was running on fumes, short of fuel, short of replacements, but powered by technical brilliance. The Americans, by contrast, were fueled by industrial might, the power of factories, supply lines, and mechanical repetition. And in that difference lay both their strength and their weakness. By late 1944, the U.S. Army had deployed over 49,000 Sherman tanks across Europe. No other machine embodied American warfare so completely, mass-produced, standardized, and dependable. The doctrine behind it was simple quantity over complexity. The Sherman could be repaired quickly, transported easily, and built in days. But war, as it turned out, didn't always respect doctrine. The harsh winter of the Ardennes exposed the Sherman's vulnerabilities like never before. Fuel lines froze solid, oil thickened into sludge. Engines that had performed well in France began to seize in the sub-zero temperatures of Belgium. Tanks became steel coffins, immobile targets for German artillery. American maintenance companies were overwhelmed. The Army's official manuals offered clean, ideal procedures, but those procedures assumed warm depots, stocked parts, and time. None of those existed anymore. The front was moving too fast, the roads too choked, the air too bitter. In field workshops improvised under canvas and broken barns, mechanics faced impossible choices. Should they obey the rules and risk losing tanks to the cold, or defy them and risk court-martial? Most chose the former. A few of the desperate, the inventive, the reckless chose the latter. Corporal Harold "Red" Lawson was one of them. Before the war, he'd been an auto mechanic in Kansas City, tuning engines for drag racers and delivery trucks. He understood combustion not as theory, but as the rhythm of the pulse of a living machine. To him, the Sherman's engine was no mystery. It was a beast restrained by regulation. In the Army, however, maintenance was about obedience, not innovation. The manuals were gospel. Every torque setting, every part number, every lubrication schedule dictated by the Ordnance Corps in Washington. The reason was standardization. A Sherman in Belgium had to be identical to one in Italy or Normandy, so that supply chains remained predictable. But that very predictability was killing men. Reports from the 3rd and 7th Armored Divisions described Shermans failing to start under fire, transmissions freezing during retreats, and recoil systems locking up after repeated firing in sub-zero weather. Mechanics discovered that minor field adjustments to things as small as tweaking the carburetor's air-fuel ratio or changing engine timing could drastically improve cold weather performance. But they were forbidden to make such alterations. Unauthorized modification was a punishable offense under military law. Still, rumors spread quickly across the Ardennes. Someone in the 10th Armored reportedly added alcohol to coolant to stop freezing. Another unit rerouted exhaust to warm engines overnight. Small victories, tiny acts of rebellion against the frozen logic of bureaucracy. Lawson's act of defiance fit this same pattern. When his tank's engine began to sputter and lag in sub-zero air, he didn't reach for the manual. He reached for a wrench. He had noticed something days earlier. The cold was starving the engine of oxygen, while the fuel mixture remained rich, choking combustion. His idea was dangerous. Adjust the intake and throttle linkage, bypassing the restrictor that controlled fuel flow. It would push the engine past its designed limits. Too much heat and the block could crack, but just enough and the Sherman might roar like never before. To most officers, this would have been mechanical heresy. But to Lawson, it was survival. Across the lines, similar experiments began surfacing. Tank crews shared whispered advice between bursts of artillery. Run it hotter. Don't let it idle cold. Keep the oil moving. Some mechanics even swapped out captured German lubricants or cut holes in engine hoods for better airflow. The battlefield was becoming a laboratory, every mistake paid for in blood. Meanwhile, the German Panthers, though technically superior, were also suffering. Their engines were overcomplicated and prone to failure in the cold. Their fuel consumption was monstrous, and their maintenance demands were extreme. For every Panther that advanced, another broke down or froze in place. The difference was that German crews weren't allowed to innovate either. Orders were orders and innovation was punished. Thus, on both sides of the Ardennes front, tanks and men fought not just each other, but their own machinery. And within that chaos, a handful of field modifications, unrecorded, unofficial, and entirely against the rules, began to turn the tide in small but meaningful ways. Shermans that had been sluggish days before started maneuvering faster. Gun turrets rotated smoother. Engines ran hotter, yes, but they ran. Those small acts of rebellion would soon converge in a single engagement, a moment when one mechanic's forbidden fix would prove that ingenuity could matter more than regulation, and that the human hand could outperform the manual. And that moment was coming fast. Every battle in the Ardennes had two sides: the visible clash of armor and firepower, and the invisible war of human ingenuity. The story of Lawson's forbidden fix cannot be understood without exploring the angles that defined it. Mechanical, tactical, and psychological. The Battle of the Bulge was, in many ways, a mechanic's nightmare. The freezing temperatures paralyzed machines as effectively as enemy fire. Oil turned to paste. Batteries died overnight. Hydraulics seized. The Sherman tank's design efficiency in the temperate fields of Normandy became temperamental in the Ardennes cold. The Ford GAA V8 engine, though robust, was sensitive to air density and fuel vaporization. Under extreme cold, carburetors failed to deliver a proper mix of air and fuel, leading to sluggish throttle response and frequent stalling. Official Army ordnance reports later admitted that more tanks were immobilized by weather than by enemy fire in the first week of the offensive. But in the field, no such reports existed. There were only men with wrenches and desperation. Lawson's unauthorized adjustment of a manual override of the fuel mixture system was, in truth, a mechanical masterpiece born from instinct. He didn't invent a new engine. He simply freed it from its limitations. By increasing airflow and fuel combustion temperature, he allowed the Sherman to maintain higher RPMs under freezing load. It was risky. It made the engine run hotter, dangerously close to burnout, but it also made it responsive, fast, and alive again. And in tank combat, seconds of responsiveness meant survival. The Germans had precision. The Americans now had adaptability. In that balance lay the future of the battlefield. The Sherman's greatest flaw wasn't just its thinner armor, it was how that armor dictated tactics. Head-on duels were suicide. Every American tanker knew it. The Panther's long 75mm gun could penetrate a Sherman from over 1,500 meters. In contrast, the Sherman's 75mm could only penetrate a Panther's side at roughly 500 meters. That brutal arithmetic shaped how the U.S. Army fought. Sherman crews relied on mobility, coordination, and sheer numbers. They would flank the enemy, overwhelm him with speed and communication, and exploit the Panther's slower turret traverse. But to do that, their tanks had to move. They had to respond instantly, gear up, throttle forward, and turn tight. A sluggish engine in that environment was dead. When a Sherman hesitated, even for a few seconds, it became an easy target. This is why Lawson's fix mattered so much. His forbidden adjustment wasn't just a technical tweak, it was a tactical revolution. The modified Shermans could pivot and accelerate faster than before. Their crews could reposition mid-battle, using terrain and agility to outmaneuver German armor. In the Battle of St. Vith, tank commanders began to notice the difference. One platoon's tanks, those serviced by Lawson and his fellow mechanics, moved more fluidly, kept tighter formations, and avoided being caught in ambush positions. Small victories followed. A Panther destroyed at close range, another immobilized during retreat. None of it made the Sherman invincible. But it gave the crews a fighting chance, and in the Ardennes that was everything. Perhaps the greatest weapon in any army is morale. And during the early days of the Bulge, American morale was cracking. Units were retreating. Towns like St. Vith and Bastogne were being surrounded. The once confident tank crews who had rolled triumphantly through France now faced machines they called monsters. Panther tanks inspired dread. Their arrival on the battlefield brought an almost mythic terror. The long, sleek barrel emerging from fog was a sight that froze men in their tracks. Inside their steel shells, Sherman crews fought two enemies, the Germans ahead, and their own growing fear. They joked about their tanks being death traps, but the humor was thin. Many wrote in letters home that they felt outclassed and doomed before the fight began. Then came Lawson's fix and others like it. Word spread quickly among the tankers. Red's Sherman runs hot, but it moves like a panther. Crews started to believe again. When one tank moved smoother, another tried the same adjustment. It wasn't about horsepower. It was about hope. In that frozen battlefield, morale became contagious. The men began to trust their machines again, to feel that their survival wasn't just in the hands of generals or engineers thousands of miles away, but in their own. Even officers who condemned such unauthorized modifications couldn't deny the results. In the field, the line between discipline and desperation blurred. The unspoken rule became simple. If it works, do it. That subtle shift from fear to self-reliance was more powerful than any weapon, because when men start believing they can change their fate, even machines begin to fight differently. And as the battle deepened, that belief, that blend of defiance and ingenuity, began to spread far beyond Lawson's unit. Across snow-choked valleys and burning villages, other crews and mechanics started pushing their Shermans past design limits, breaking rules, and rediscovering something ancient in warfare: necessity as the mother of invention. Each small act was invisible to command reports, but together, they were reshaping the character of the American tank force. The next angles would reveal just how deep that transformation ran, not just in machines and tactics, but in leadership, culture, and survival. If the first angles of this story revealed how machines and men began to change, the next reveal why they did: leadership, culture, and morality. The unseen gears turning behind every battlefield decision. For in the winter of 1944, innovation wasn't born from design bureaus or generals' desks. It came from the frozen hands of soldiers who refused to surrender to failure. The U.S. Army of 1944 was a machine built on order. Every part had its place, every soldier his function. But war, especially a war as chaotic as the Ardennes, has a way of testing command philosophies. At the top, generals like Omar Bradley and George S. Patton believed in discipline through doctrine. Success came from adherence to procedure, from predictability, not improvisation. The Ordnance Corps followed this same philosophy. Its manuals were law. The Sherman tank's standardization was considered a sacred logistical triumph that allowed America to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. To the men on the ground, however, those same rules often felt like shackles. Mechanics knew the machines intimately. They knew when the oil was too thick, when a timing belt screamed under strain, when the engine wanted to breathe differently. Yet every instinct they had was suppressed by orders written far from the front lines. When reports reached officers that field mechanics were experimenting with carburetors and exhaust systems, reactions were mixed. Some commanders, desperate to keep their tanks running, quietly allowed it. Others threatened punishment. This created a tension that cut through the armored divisions between innovation and obedience. The paradox was clear. The same army that prided itself on mass production was now relying on individual craftsmanship to survive. And in that contradiction, the American war machine showed its true nature: a blend of system and spirit, rule and rebellion. Improvisation in wartime isn't free. Every unauthorized fix carried risk, not only mechanical, but human. Tanks that ran hotter were faster, yes, but also more volatile. Overstressed engines could ignite. Fuel lines could rupture. A misjudged mixture could lead to engine failure at the worst possible moment. Corporal Lawson's own tank became a gamble every time it started. He'd listen to the engine like a heartbeat: too fast and it could blow, too slow and it could die. Every mission was a balance between power and peril. One report from a nearby maintenance unit told of a tank destroyed not by enemy fire, but by an overheated engine that detonated during combat. The crew never escaped. Stories like that spread quickly and whispered warnings among mechanics who tried to emulate Lawson's fix. Still, most pressed on. Because the alternative, a lifeless tank in a German crosshair, was worse. This was the hidden moral calculus of the battlefield. The men who broke regulations weren't seeking glory. They were gambling their own safety to give their crews a fighting chance. Their courage wasn't in charging forward with a rifle, but in twisting a wrench under fire, knowing one mistake could kill them all. Many of those names never entered history books. But in their quiet defiance lay the beating heart of American adaptability. The most remarkable truth about Lawson's modification, and those like it, was how effective they proved to be. By the final week of December 1944, field reports from various armored divisions noted a subtle but measurable improvement in operational readiness. Tanks that had previously failed to start in freezing temperatures were now running reliably. Mobility increased. In several sectors, notably near Bastogne and St. Vith, small armored units began executing faster flanking maneuvers against German formations, something almost unheard of earlier in the campaign. It wasn't that the Sherman had become superior to the Panther overnight. Far from it. But its agility, once hampered by cold and regulation, had been restored by the ingenuity of men like Lawson. What's more, these fixes began to circulate unofficially through word of mouth and handwritten notes. Mechanics scrawled adjustments on ration boxes, fuel drums, even scraps of map paper. The unofficial manual of the Ardennes was born a living document of defiance and adaptation. This kind of innovation couldn't be ordered from above. It had to grow from necessity below. And it did, spreading like wildfire through the frozen forests. War always raises a question that technology cannot answer. When is it right to disobey? For Lawson and countless others, the answer was found in silence in the moment, when an officer looked away and a mechanic made the change anyway. The moral conflict wasn't about pride or defiance. It was about survival. Disobedience became a form of duty. In peacetime, his act would have been grounds for punishment. But in war, especially a war against the clockwork precision of the Wehrmacht, flexibility became a weapon. There's a quiet heroism in that. Not the cinematic kind of storming a hill or firing a cannon, but the stoic courage of men who take responsibility into their own hands. Because innovation, in its truest sense, is an act of faith that the risk is worth the cost, that a small change can shift a great tide, and in the Ardennes those small changes began to tilt the balance. By the end of December 1944, a strange thing was happening. Amid the chaos, American tanks were moving faster, fighting harder, surviving longer. No new weapon had been introduced. No grand order had been issued. What changed was the mindset of men, and soon, that shift would culminate in one defining engagement when the lessons of all those forbidden fixes were tested under the most brutal fire imaginable, the mere. Next moment in this story isn't about rules or manuals anymore. It's about battle where theory meets the cold steel of consequence. December 22, 1944, near St. Vith, Belgium. The snow had stopped falling, but the air hung heavy with smoke and fear. The town, once a quiet crossroads, was now a shattered fortress of burning trucks and frozen corpses. German armor was closing in from the east and south. For the Americans of the 7th Armored Division, there was nowhere left to retreat. The order was simple: hold the line. But simple had no meaning here. Communications were breaking down. Ammunition was scarce. The roads were choked with wrecks. And most dangerously, the tanks were failing. Lawson's platoon, part of the 31st Tank Battalion, had been fighting for nearly 48 hours without rest. Their Shermans were battle-worn, half their support vehicles lost. At dawn, they received word that a Panther platoon was advancing down the N626, the last route that kept St. Vith connected to the rear. If it fell, the town would be surrounded completely. The American commander's voice over the radio was grim. All units hold that road. Delay them at all costs. Lawson knew what that meant. Delay was the Army's polite word for sacrifice. He climbed onto his Sherman hull number 42, nicknamed Betsy Lou, and slapped the frozen side panel. Inside, his driver and gunner were pale with exhaustion. The tank's engine had been running rough for hours. In the cold, the oil pressure gauge quivered like a dying heartbeat. Then he made the choice that would define everything. He pulled the rear hatch open, ripped off his gloves, and reached into the engine compartment. The Ford V8 was steaming, coughing black smoke. He adjusted the throttle linkage, bypassed the air restrictor, the same forbidden fix he'd first made in secret days earlier, and muttered, "Come on, girl, breathe." The engine roared to life, louder than before. The RPM needle jumped. It was a dangerous sound, one that could burn the engine out within minutes, but it also meant power. The other mechanics in his platoon noticed. Within half an hour, several more Shermans had been tuned in the same way, each one running hotter, louder, more responsive. It was a gamble, but at that moment everyone understood the stakes. At 10:20 a.m., the Panthers came, through the drifting smoke. Their shapes emerged massive, angular, painted in white camouflage streaked with mud. Their engines growled like living beasts. The first Panther fired from 1,000 meters. The shell tore through the air, striking a Sherman and blowing it apart in a storm of fire and steel. Lawson's crew flinched as shrapnel clattered against their armor. "Traverse left. Range 800. The gunner shouted. The Panther's frontal armor gleamed like a mirror in the snow. The first American shell ricocheted harmlessly. Another Sherman beside them tried to move, its engine stalled. It never got a second chance, but Betsy Lou moved. Fast. Faster than any Sherman had a right to move. Lawson's driver slammed the gear and the tank lunged forward across the frozen field, engine screaming. They cut behind a ridge, flanked hard right. The gunner lined up the shot as the tank jolted over uneven ground. The sight picture flickered as the Panther's exposed side flashed for a second. Fire! The 75mm round struck true. A burst of flame erupted from the German tank's engine deck. The crew inside Betsy Lou erupted in cheers, hoarse, desperate, disbelieving. One Panther destroyed, 3 more advancing. The radio crackled with frantic voices. Sherman 42 got one. Repeat, they got one. Other American tanks followed the movement, using the same aggressive flanking tactics the manuals barely mentioned. The faster acceleration, courtesy of Lawson's forbidden modification, lets them dodge incoming fire, reposition quicker, and exploit openings. The battle that followed was short, brutal, and deafening. Panthers fired from hull-down positions, methodical and cold. Shermans darted between snowbanks and smoldering wrecks, their engines howling under strain. Every tank was on the edge of mechanical failure, throttles redlined, gauges maxed. But speed, for once, was on the American side. One Panther tried to swing its turret toward Betsy Lou, but Lawson's driver outmaneuvered it, cutting through a small ravine. They came up on the enemy's flank, firing point blank. The shell penetrated under the turret ring and an explosion tore through the hull. 2 Panthers destroyed. The others withdrew, their confidence shaken. By noon, the road to St. Vith was littered with burning armor, German and American alike. Lawson's tank limped back to cover, its engine temperature nearing the red line. The modification had worked, but just barely. Any longer, and the block might have cracked. As the smoke cleared, a young lieutenant approached Lawson, his face streaked with soot. "What the hell did you do to that tank?" he asked. Lawson just grinned through the grime. Made her run the way she should have from the start. That day, the line held. The German advance was delayed long enough for reinforcements to regroup west of the town, a delay that would later prove critical in blunting the entire southern thrust of the Bulge. The battle wasn't over, but something fundamental had changed. In the heart of chaos, under the shadow of the mighty Panther, one mechanic's defiance had given the Sherman something it had never truly had before: confidence. And that confidence was about to spread beyond one platoon to the entire division. By nightfall, the sky over St. Vith burned red, the horizon pulsed with artillery flashes, and the distant rumble of armor rolled like thunder through the valleys. The 7th Armored Division had survived the day, but barely. The men were exhausted, frostbitten, and low on shells. Yet amid the wreckage and chaos, a rumor began to spread. Lawson's Shermans are outrunning the Panthers. Something's different about those tanks. At first, it was just talk among the mechanics and drivers, tales traded over coffee brewed in steel helmets. But as more crews saw it with their own eyes, disbelief turned into curiosity, then into imitation. By midnight, word had reached battalion command. One of the senior maintenance officers, Captain McAllister, stormed into Lawson's makeshift repair pit, a bombed-out farmhouse where tanks idled under torn tarps. "Corporal Lawson," he barked, "you've been modifying engines without authorization." Lawson stood, grease-streaked and unshaven. "Yes, sir. But it kept us alive." McAllister's glare faltered for just a second as he glanced toward Betsy Lou, its paint scorched, its engine still ticking hot. He had seen the after-action reports. That single tank platoon had destroyed 3 Panthers, delayed a regiment and bought time for a withdrawal that saved hundreds of lives. McAllister sighed. You understand this violates every field regulation we've got? Yes, sir. Then why'd you do it? Lawson met his eyes. Because regulations don't stop 88mm shells. For a long moment, the officer said nothing. Then quietly, keep doing whatever you're doing. Just don't write it down. And with that unofficial blessing, the Lawson fix began to spread. Within 24 hours, nearly a dozen Shermans in the sector had been modified. It was dangerously simple. Mechanics removed air restrictors, widened fuel intake valves, and adjusted the throttle linkage to allow higher RPMs. It pushed the Ford GAA engine beyond its design limits, but in the desperate cold of the Ardennes, overheating was less of a concern. By December 23rd, the difference was unmistakable. On the road to Poteau, a platoon of Shermans ambushed a German column. Instead of the usual sluggish start, they moved with surprising agility, darting between hedgerows, shifting position faster than enemy gunners could adjust. Their engines roared like aircraft. A Panther fired missed by inches. The Sherman responded with a quick side shot and blew out its track. For the first time in days, the Americans chased the enemy armor instead of retreating from it. Meanwhile, the German side was growing frustrated. Panther crews reported that the American tanks were attacking with abnormal speed, some even closing in for point-blank engagements, something rarely seen before. At a command post near Stavelot, a captured German officer was questioned about his unit's setbacks. His response was blunt. Your Shermans, they are faster now. Too fast to hit. Of course, not every modified tank survived. Some engines seized, others caught fire. A few literally blew their gaskets mid-battle. But for every Sherman that broke down, another managed to flank or outmaneuver an enemy machine that once seemed invincible. It wasn't magic. It was momentum. In war, momentum is everything. By Christmas Eve, the U.S. Army's situation in the Ardennes had begun to stabilize. Reinforcements were arriving, weather was clearing, and the German offensive was losing its brutal rhythm. Yet among the tank battalions that had endured the worst, something intangible had changed. Crews who had once whispered about the cursed, Sherman now spoke of her with pride. They painted fresh names on their hulls: Hotfoot, Firebelly, Runnin' Wild. Each one carried the marks of Lawson's defiance: scorched exhausts, blackened engine hatches, melted snow around the tracks from the constant heat. They weren't standard issue anymore. They were survival machines. In the official reports, none of this was mentioned. The Army's documentation would later describe the sudden uptick in mobility as a result of improved maintenance efficiency under field conditions. But among those who were there, the truth was an open secret. It wasn't efficient. It was a rebellion. December 25, 1944 dawn. The snow reflected an eerie orange glow as flares arced over the battlefield. The remnants of Lawson's platoon rolled toward the crossroads at Manhay. Ahead of them, another Panther platoon had taken position, covering the road with overlapping fields of fire. For the Americans, this was supposed to be suicide. But Lawson's voice came over the radio. Calm, steady, almost casual. Let's give 'em one more surprise, boys. Betsy Lou roared to life, the engine screaming past safe limits. The tank shot forward across the open field, treads throwing snow like a storm. 2 Shermans followed, then 3 more. The Panthers opened fire. Shells tore through the air, exploding short, wide, high, but never quite on target. The American tanks were moving too fast, too erratically. One Sherman hit a frozen ditch, bounced, and still kept going. Another flanked wide, cutting through the tree line. Within minutes, the Panthers were under assault from multiple angles. Their commanders couldn't adjust fast enough. Lawson's gunner fired. The first shell struck home. Then another. When the smoke cleared, 2 Panthers burned, a third was crippled, and the road was clear. As the tanks regrouped, the radio filled with cheers. Men laughed for the first time in days. A weary voice crackled through the static. Merry Christmas, 7th Armored. You're still in the fight. Lawson sat back in his seat, the heat from the overworked engine filling the cabin. He looked down at the temperature gauge needle buried past the red and smiled faintly. Good girl, he muttered. That day, the modified Shermans didn't just win a skirmish. They restored faith in the machine, in the crew, in the possibility that the underdog could still fight back. It was still the same tank that had been called undergunned and under-armored. But in the Ardennes, with a handful of bold mechanics willing to break the rules, the Sherman became something else entirely, a symbol of stubborn American ingenuity, a rolling declaration that even when outmatched, they would never stop fighting. The Battle of the Bulge did not end in a single victory or heroic charge. It ended in attrition, endurance, and sheer willpower. By early January 1945, the German offensive had spent its fury. The Wehrmacht's vaunted spearhead had stalled, its tanks stranded on roads littered with wreckage and corpses, frozen in the snow. But for the men of the 7th Armored Division and countless others who fought along that 80-mile front, the memory that lingered was not of strategy maps or field orders. It was the sound, the roar of Sherman engines that refused to die. Those modified tanks, once seen as desperate improvisations, had become the lifeblood of mobility. Wherever the front threatened to break, these hot-rodded Shermans appeared, sometimes limping, sometimes belching smoke, but always moving. They became known informally among troops as Lawson Specials. Unrecorded in any official document, the modifications spread quietly from unit to unit. Mechanics shared the trick under the guise of winter tuning, while officers looked the other way. In the face of German armor that was technologically superior, the Americans had rediscovered a weapon even more powerful than steel adaptability. After the war, military historians would argue endlessly over why the Sherman performed as well as it did in Europe despite its flaws. Its 75mm gun could rarely penetrate the front armor of a Panther or Tiger. Its armor was barely adequate. Yet the tank's reliability, speed, and ease of repair made it a logistical marvel. What few would acknowledge was the role of the unauthorized. In dusty depots and field repair yards across Belgium, ordinary mechanics pushed the limits of the machine not out of defiance, but out of survival. One sergeant from the 10th Armored later recalled, "The book told us what the Sherman couldn't do. The battlefield told us what it had to do. We stopped reading the book." That same pragmatic spirit defined the late stages of the Bulge. As Allied air power returned with clearer skies, Sherman's fast, maneuverable, and repairable became the backbone of the counteroffensive. While Panthers and Tigers bogged down in snow or ran out of fuel, the Shermans kept rolling. In the first week of January at Bastogne, a column of Lawson-type modified tanks spearheaded a push that linked up with Patton's Third Army. The move broke the encirclement and reopened supply lines. Though few outside the division ever knew his name, Harold Lawson's handiwork was part of that victory. Ironically, official post-war reports made no mention of engine modifications. To the Ordnance Corps, the notion of tampering with factory configurations was unthinkable. The GAA engine was already operating near its rated limit. Any unauthorized increase in RPMs risked engine failure or fire, and the military bureaucracy had no tolerance for that kind of risk. So, the Lawson fix remained folklore. Veterans told the story in mess halls and reunions how a field mechanic broke the rules and somehow made the Shermans run like race cars through the snow. It became part legend, part truth, one of those quiet miracles that history tends to overlook. In one surviving interview decades later, a former gunner from Lawson's crew reflected, "He didn't change the war. He just changed our war. That was enough." For those who lived through those frozen days, that distinction mattered little. What they remembered was that, when the situation seemed hopeless, when the enemy's tanks were bigger, stronger, and deadlier, one man's hands and a wrench made the difference between retreat and resistance. By mid-January 1945, the tide had turned decisively. German armored formations withdrew, crippled by fuel shortages and relentless Allied counterattacks. Towns like La Roche, Houffalize, and St. Vith, once lost, were retaken, and in nearly every column that rolled eastward through the snow, the Sherman led the way. Engines howled, treads clattered, and the once derided Ronson, the so-called Zippo lighter tank, had proven itself not through superiority of design, but through the ingenuity of those who refused to accept defeat. The war in Europe still had months to go, but in the Ardennes, something fundamental had shifted. The Panther's mystique and its aura of invincibility had been cracked, and somewhere in the heart of that vast, frozen front, Harold Lawson and his battered tank crew rolled forward once more. the roar of their engine echoing like defiance across the snow. In the months that followed the Battle of the Bulge, the war in Europe changed pace. The momentum had shifted firmly to the Allies. Patton's armored columns thundered eastward into Germany, Montgomery's forces pressed from the north, and behind them a flood of supplies, fuel, and repaired vehicles surged forward like a logistical tide. Among them were the Shermans, thousands of them. The same tank that had struggled against the Panther in Normandy now rolled almost unopposed across the Rhineland. The difference was not the machine alone, but the mindset of those who drove and maintained it. The lessons of the Ardennes spread quietly, like a whisper through the ranks. Field mechanics continued to tune engines for winter efficiency. Tank commanders drilled their crews in aggressive flanking tactics, and confidence replaced the old fatalism. For once, the Sherman's greatest weakness, its lightness, became its greatest strength. While the heavier German tanks bogged down in mud and ice, the modified American machines could dart through narrow forest roads and icy rivers. In the words of one British officer observing the U.S. advance, "The Yanks have made a virtue of what was once a flaw. They've turned speed into armor." The official records would never credit any single mechanic for this change. Harold Lawson's name remained absent from every ordnance report, every technical bulletin, every Army archive. But in motor pools and veterans' reunions, he became something else. A legend passed down like an old soldier's campfire tale. They said his hands never stopped moving, even in sleep. That he could listen to an engine idle and tell you its problem before opening the hatch. That he had turned a doctrine-bound machine into a living thing. What mattered most wasn't the myth, it was the meaning. Lawson represented something deeply American in that winter of 1944. A refusal to obey limitations written by men far from the front. When the rules said stop, he found a way to go. It was that defiance, disciplined, desperate, but creative, that turned the Sherman into a weapon capable of outlasting Germany's most fearsome armor. Historians later described the Bulge as the last great gamble of the Third Reich, a final bid to split the Allied front and force a negotiated peace. It failed for many reasons: Hitler's overreach, logistical shortages, the stubborn defense of Bastogne. But among the subtle, less visible reasons was one rarely mentioned: the ingenuity of Allied mechanics who refused to yield to engineering hierarchy. While German tanks were masterpieces of design, complex, precise, and fragile, the Sherman was simple, crude, and infinitely adaptable. A wrench, a few spare parts, and a daring mechanic could rebuild it in the field. The Panther, for all its power, needed a factory. That difference, multiplied by thousands of miles and thousands of men, helped decide the outcome of the Ardennes. When peace finally came in May 1945, Lawson returned home to Illinois. He didn't talk much about the war. He opened a small repair shop on the edge of town, fixing tractors and trucks instead of tanks. Neighbors said he was quiet, methodical, and always smelled faintly of oil and smoke. Years later, when a local paper interviewed him for a Veterans Day article, the reporter asked if he'd ever done anything unusual in the war. Lawson smiled faintly and replied, "Just kept things running. That's what mattered. No medals, no recognition, just the satisfaction of knowing that somewhere in the frozen woods of Belgium, the machines he'd touched had kept men alive." Decades later, military engineers would rediscover the archival reports and note minor discrepancies in field performance data from Sherman units in late 1944. Higher than normal speed averages, shorter warm-up times, increased engine wear. To historians, they were statistical anomalies. To those who knew the story, they were signatures, the unrecorded fingerprints of the mechanic who broke the rules. The Ardennes was the last great winter of the Second World War. It was where American endurance met German precision and where improvisation proved mightier than perfection. The Panther was a masterpiece of war, but the Sherman, in the hands of men like Harold Lawson, became a masterpiece of survival, and in the end, that's what won the war. War is often remembered through the noise, the thunder of guns, the clash of machines, the roar of engines that drown out the human heart. But beneath all that fury lies something quieter, something that truly defines victory. Not power, not perfection, but persistence. The story of Harold Lawson is not about a hero with medals or a machine that changed the war. It is about one man's refusal to accept defeat, even when the rulebook said there was nothing left to try. It is about the small, defiant choices, the kind that never make it into reports or speeches, yet ripple through the chaos to alter the course of history. The Panther was born from brilliance engineered with precision, armored with fear. The Sherman was born from necessity, designed to be built fast, fixed fast, and replaced fast. On paper, the German tank should have always won. But the battlefield does not read blueprints. It listens to the will of the men who fight within the machines. Lawson's wrench was not a weapon, yet it struck as hard as any gun. In his hands, cold steel became something more than machinery. It became a vessel for hope. When he turned that bolt, when he broke that rule, he wasn't just modifying an engine. He was rewriting the balance between fear and courage, because in war, every victory begins with someone deciding that impossible is just a word. In the end, the forests of the Ardennes would thaw, the snow would melt, and the tanks, Sherman and Panther alike, would rust into silence. But the spirit that kept them running through that winter would endure. It lives on in every mechanic who refuses to quit, every soldier who fights when the odds say surrender, every human who believes that survival is worth breaking a few rules for. Harold Lawson never sought glory. He simply made his tank move, and in doing so helped history move with it. The war would end, the machines would fade, but the lesson would remain. Sometimes the greatest victories are built by hands, not headlines.